Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 16, Section 2, The Affluent Society. So as we go along, follow along and get your notes. Here we go. Roman numeral 1, American Abundance. Letter A. In the 1950s, the numbers of suburban dwellers doubled, while the population of the cities rose by only 10%. And what we're going to see is a boom in building of homes in these suburban areas. As a result, we're going to start seeing urban decay, meaning that the areas of near the center of communities, center of cities, or as we would call it, the inner city, is going to start becoming a little more dilapidated and kind of falling apart. And as a result, a lot of young, wealthy families are going to move out to these brand new suburbs. We're going to have to build new schools, new parks, new shopping centers, even new roads to make that, accessible for people on a day-to-day basis. Letter B. From 1945 to 1961 was a period known as the baby boom. More than 65 million children were born in the United States during that period of time. If you take a look at the graph below here, this is kind of a nice chart of our baby boomers that are here in the red. It kind of dips down when we talk about our Generation X and kind of rises again with our millennials. The thing about our baby boomers, these were kids who were born mostly by former soldiers who had served in World War II. They came home, got married, got a house, had a family. And as the 1940s wraps up and we go into the 50s and the 1960s, their families expand by leaps and bounds. And this puts a lot of pressure on our society. We're going to find that schools are not going to accommodate all these brand new bodies. And so we're going to have to build more school buildings. We're going to have more shopping and more stores and more this and that. And in a way, it kind of has a result of, for the most part, not only pushing the seams of our nation as far as population is concerned, but it also the seams of our wallet. It was a huge economic boom as a result of this. In 1956, more Americans were working in offices in what we call white-collar jobs. White-collar jobs are professional jobs, usually requiring a college education or some sort of training, maybe in a technical school, outnumbering the number of blue-collar jobs. These are workers who are primarily working in factories. So in a way, our society is changing. We're going from a more industrial society to a more service-ended economy. And that's going to continue well beyond the baby boomers. Really, it's still going on today when we talk about the technological boom that we've had in the United States. Going back and looking at our ups and downs and baby booms and such, you can kind of follow the line graph here. This is the number of babies born in 1940. You can see kind of how it spikes during the war years. Maybe a lot of couples getting married, having kids very quickly before maybe the husband is sent off to war. And then we get to about 1942, 43, and we take a dip. When the war ends, we have a huge spike, and it kind of rides that way till we get to about 1957 or so, and we start seeing it dwindling off a little bit till it reaches really kind of the low point around 1967, 68, somewhere in that ballpark. As we go along, we're going to eventually talk a little bit about the pros and cons of living in suburbia. And as you're kind of taking your notes here, I want you to think about maybe the good and the bad of that, and also the good and bad of roles for men and women in the 1950s. Roman numeral 2, the new mass media. By 1957, more than 80% of families had a television. Television was developed really before even World War II. It had made its debut, I think, back in the mid-1930s. But for the most part, it was technology that most people couldn't afford, and there weren't a lot of TV stations that were, located throughout the nation. But when the war ends and people are starting to have a little bit more money in their wallets and their bank accounts, people are starting to desire this new technology. And to help that, more and more radio stations are kind of converting over to television stations. And so there's more programming available. By the time we get to about the 1950s, there are all sorts of variety of television programming that's on. An individual could watch shows like I Love Lucy, or they could watch variety shows like Ed Sullivan. So it became kind of like must-see kind of activities that people would go to their friends' homes to watch a certain program once a week, especially if they didn't have a TV of their own. Letter B. Radio had one audience that television could not reach, and that's people who were traveling in their cars. In the 1950s, a lot of new cars that were being built had radios that were basically factory installed, and so this allowed people to have entertainment pretty much on the go. As far as other breakthroughs, we got to talk about the medical things, and we're going to kind of allude to this here in a little bit. But starting really in the 1940s, we have the advent of antibiotics, particularly penicillin and other antibiotics that are used to help fight diseases. We get into the 1950s, antihistamines, when you talk about people who have colds or sinus issues. Eventually, we're going to have heart-lung machines that are going to make really surgery, especially when we talk about the heart, a little bit more practical and safe. As we go on, Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin and some of the research that they did on polio, and eventually Salk is going to have a polio vaccine that is going to be injected, and we're going to see lots of children that are going to get those shots. Within a year, Sabin is going to come up with an oral vaccine that's basically like a syrup that you can take. And as a result of this, we're going to alleviate polio in the United States. We're going to kind of squish that out. So today, it's not necessarily something that we worry about as an epidemic. Other things, early 1950s, we've kind of figured out that smoking is related to lung cancer, and eventually the American Heart Association is really going to start warning people about the dangers of that. Roman numeral 3, new music and poetry. Letter A, rock and roll music was the new form of music that kind of came out of the 1950s and really kind of blossomed in the 1960s. But it has roots in African-American rhythms and sounds and beats. You could talk about the pure American form of music known as jazz and R&B records that were sometimes known as race records, black records. But by the time we get to about the early 1950s, kind of moving into the mid-50s, individuals like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis really were well-known celebrities. And their music was kind of controversial. It's kind of like music that your parents would hate. It's kind of the music that they performed. And today we look back, it's been almost 60 years since they kind of brought this music forth, and we look back and think how innocent it is. But at the time, a lot of adults saw these records as being very vulgar, and they did not like it. Matter of fact, there were preachers and pastors that called for the breaking of these records, the banning of them, because they thought it had a really bad influence on young Americans. Letter B, writers. Beat writers or beatniks were poets, writers, and artists that harshly criticized what they considered to be the sterility and the conformity of American life. Probably the most noted was a man named Jack Kerouac. Kerouac was a writer. He wrote a book called On the Road, which is actually kind of a long prose. The story was when Kerouac wrote this, He wrote it on one roll of paper, and it was a continuous roll. And he took it to an editor, and the editor was just, dumbfounded. Number one, that there was no punctuation. Matter of fact, there were no indentations for paragraphs. It would be a nightmare for editing, and yet it becomes one of the probably best known pieces of literature of that era of time. Some other things going on when we talk about some advantages as far as economics and life in general. I do want to point out that life expectancy as we move through the 1940s and kind of get to the end of the 1950s certainly has gone up. When you talk about the gross national product, the GNP, and that's kind of the wealth of our nation, you got to look at it per capita. That's like wealth per person. The average income in 1940 was around $750. By the time we get to the late 1950s, early 1960s, the average yearly income for individuals is around $27,000 or $2,700. That might not seem like a lot of money in today's terms, but you got to think about it like this: a brand new car in 1959 probably was a little less than $2,700. A new home, you might be able to buy a home for anywhere between 10 to 15,000. So in reality, wages are getting better, life is getting better during this period of time. Thank you very much.